In one of the most famous instances of political protest at the Olympics, Tommie Smith and John Carlos raised their fists above their heads after competing in the 200-meter dash in 1968 at the Mexico City Games. A white Australian, Peter Norman, stands next to them in solidarity. All three men are wearing the same pin. This moment came to be known as the Black Power protest, and it was that, but there's even more to this story. It involves national and international politics, a sneaker that the men weren't even wearing but still managed to change Olympics history, and an excellent example of how clothing and style can be used as symbols for revolution. Even if some people want the Olympics to be apolitical or insist that they are, they never have been, and I don't think they ever will be. If anything, the Olympics are the perfect world stage for issues within countries and between them to come to light. On the other hand, you can also find a lot of fashion history intertwined with the games. For most of us, fashion is something fun and frivolous, right? We like going out and buying clothing and putting together our little outfits. But for something like the Olympics, what athletes wear while they compete on the world stage, representing different countries, has huge impact and huge import. What they wear when they're competing says a lot about what sort of technology they have access to, and what they wear during something like the opening ceremony says a lot about a country's culture and values. So far for this Olympic Games, I've seen a lot of talk about the opening ceremony uniforms. Some standouts have been the Mongolia outfits, the outfits from Haiti, and those from Chinese Taipei. Even calling that team Chinese Taipei instead of Taiwan speaks a lot to the history between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland and the difficulties between them. But I want to specifically talk about sneakers. I think there's been a lot of interest lately in sneakers from the late 1960s, early 1970s, especially marathon runner style sneakers. Dries Van Noten came out with some sneakers that he said were specifically inspired by 1970s marathon runners. There is, of course, the currently controversial re-release of the Adidas SL72s, which are tied to the Munich 1972 Olympics. That would be a totally different video. If you're interested in that and the history of the 1972 Olympics, by all means, go look into it. The New Balance 327s, which I personally really like, are a 1970s vintage inspired sneaker. It's, all of these are sort of taking inspiration from, but also being updated to modern day. Plus, Onitsuka Tigers Mexico, which were super popular last year, are strongly intertwined with Olympics history, starting in the 1968 Games, going until 1972, and essentially were part of the development of Nike as a company. But the sneaker I want to talk about today is actually the Puma Suede. It played a huge role in Tommie Smith and John Carlos's protest, even though it's often left out of the conversation. So let's go back to 1968 and set the scene. The U.S. is in the throes of its civil rights movement. By the start of the Games in 1968, both Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy have been assassinated. There's apartheid regimes in both South Africa and Rhodesia. The Vietnam War is underway. The Tet Offensive started earlier that year in January. Finally, 10 days before the Summer Games began, Mexican military troops and police shot into a crowd of unarmed student protesters, killing as many as 300 people. Because of all this and more, a group of black athletes led by a San Jose State sociology professor, Harry Edwards, started the Olympic Project for Human Rights. Tommie Smith and John Carlos were both part of the movement, and it initially called for a complete boycott of the 1968 Mexico City Games. However, some athletes wound up feeling like it was important for them to participate. But not all. Most notably, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar refused to join the basketball team for the 1968 Games. The Olympic Project for Human Rights had some general demands. They were the restoration of Muhammad Ali's boxing title, which had been removed when he became a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War draft. They wanted more black coaches on the U.S. Olympics team, they wanted more black members for the International Olympics Committee, and they wanted Avery Brundage to be removed as head of the International Olympics Committee. If you look Brundage up, he's just a real villain of history. He was an anti-Semite, he was a racist, a white supremacist. He essentially was the reason that in 1936, the Olympics were held in Nazi Germany. They also wanted Rhodesia and South Africa to be disinvited from the Olympic Games. Leading up to the 200-meter dash, Smith and Carlos were fairly sure that they were going to wind up on that podium. However, Peter Norman, the Australian who stood next to them, was a complete surprise. The U.S. team didn't even really take him into account until he broke an Olympic record during one of the early heats. Knowing that their protest was essentially going to be a silent one, Smith and Carlos obviously put a lot of thought into what they were going to wear and how they were going to act in that moment. They each wore one black glove, which apparently is from the same pair. So Tommie Smith wore the black glove on his right hand, symbolizing black power, while John Carlos wore it on his left, symbolizing black unity. As you can see, Carlos is wearing a beaded necklace, which is to symbolize lynchings of black Americans. And finally, neither men are wearing shoes. They're both just wearing black socks to symbolize black American poverty. All three men are wearing the Olympic Projects for Human Rights pins. Apparently because Norman was so unprepared to win silver, he had to borrow his pin from a member of the US rowing team. Norman describes the protest like this: "I couldn't see what was happening. I had known they had gone through with their plans when a voice in the crowd sang the American anthem, but then faded to nothing. The stadium went quiet." Carlos wrote in his memoir, "There's something awful about hearing 50,000 people go silent, like being in the eye of a hurricane." He remembered that some spectators booed them and others shouted the national anthem at them in defiance. They screamed it to the point where it seemed less a national anthem than a barbaric call to arms. The protest itself was widely covered because actually 1968 was the first year that an American network broadcast the Olympic Games. So instead of previous years where they would just have like 15-minute small updates, you had hours and hours of coverage and hundreds of millions of viewers. Of course, now we consider this to be a hugely heroic feat, but these men faced almost immediate retribution. The two Americans were suspended from the US Olympics team, they were kicked out of the Olympics village, and returned home in disgrace. So that's the general story we know, and even if we ended it there, it would be an incredibly interesting narrative about the power of style and clothing as tools in the civil rights movement. But there's another angle to this protest. In fact, if you look at this picture, you can see that while the men are not wearing shoes, their shoes are on the podium with them and displayed in a very specific manner. And in this photo, Tommie Smith is actually holding one of the shoes aloft. So why is this? Smith said, "The Puma shoes were as important as the black glove and the black sock. I have them on the stand because they helped me get there during the race and long before." And Carlos said, "If you look at the way the shoes were placed on the victory stand, Mr. Smith took his shoes and placed them behind him. I took my shoes and put it where everybody could clearly see the Puma logo. They had placed the shoes at right angles from each other so that no matter where the cameras were, they were picking up that Puma logo." Now this was part of their protest. However, it was in relation to something we haven't talked about yet, and something that I personally didn't even realize was an issue. It's about endorsements. The shoe they're holding is technically not the Puma suede, it was the Puma crack, which was launched as a warm-up sneaker. It was given to athletes in the 1968 Mexico Olympics to be worn with their off-track podium looks and in general their leisure outfits. So for most of the Olympics history, and the rules for the 1968 Olympics were that you could only compete as an amateur athlete, meaning that you could not be paid. All they got was a $2 per diem. In a famous example of how athletes were penalized because of these rules, Jim Thorpe had his gold medals in the decathlon and pentathlon from the 1912 Olympics stripped from him because he had once accepted small amounts of money for playing semi-pro baseball during his college summers. The president of the International Olympics Committee, who I mentioned before, Avery Brundage, again, capital villain of this story, was a huge proponent of the amateur code. He said, "We can only rely on the support of those who believe in the principles of fair play and sportsmanship, embodied in the amateur code in our efforts to prevent the games from being used by individuals, organizations, or nations for ulterior motives." Ulterior motives meaning money. The 1968 Olympics in some ways feel like the beginning of the end for the amateur code. Both Adidas and Puma paid athletes thousands of dollars to wear their gear. Apparently more than 200 athletes were involved. However, the Los Angeles Times reported that virtually every country in the Olympics are guilty of violations in the equipment scandal. A representative from Adidas actually went to Avery Brundage and confessed, actually blaming Puma for starting a bidding war. Once Adidas came clean, Brundage and other administrators refused to even get information about which athletes had been involved. They were concerned that a huge number of American athletes were going to have their medals removed, plus since even international athletes were involved, they were concerned about the general scandal for the Olympics at large. Now, the reason Smith and Carlos were in support of endorsements was because they didn't come from money. Think about it like this. If you were wealthy, if you were privileged, then it was much easier for you to attend and compete in the Olympics. You had money for all the things you would need, travel, housing, clothing, all these things. However, if you didn't, you were essentially taking a loss. You were taking a hit both in lost income and just in general for all the costs associated. Smith and Carlos had young families. They needed the money. In 1960, the black poverty rate in the U.S. was 47%. Almost half of all black people in the U.S. were under the poverty line, and that was actually an improvement from the 1940s, where it was like 87%. The amateur code was essentially cutting people off at the knees, even though it claimed to be above financial compensation. What it resulted in was that people from wealthier backgrounds had a much greater opportunity to compete in the Olympics. By the end of the 1980s, with Avery Brundage long gone, endorsements became the norm. To wrap this up, in 2020, in what I expect was a move inspired by the Black Lives Matter protests, Puma released a very limited run of black suede sneakers, celebrating Tommy Smith's heroic protest in 1968 and their lifelong partnership with him. So that is it. Please let me know if I left anything out or if I misrepresented anything about this super important moment in Olympics history.